Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Motorsport Speak, the motorsport podcast brought to you by Motorsport Week and Motorsport Monday. My name's Dan Lawrence. As ever, I'm joined by Taylor Powling. We're talking all things Formula One Australian Grand Prix, the season opener for the 2025 campaign. And it was a chaotic race. The first wet race in Melbourne since 2012. If I'm not mistaken, it went from wet to dry again. There was home heartbreak, there was rookie heartbreak, there was Ferrari calamity, but rising above it all was Lando Norris and McLaren taking the first win of the season. So we're going to get into it all, have a little chit chat about it. First, Taylor, how are you and did you enjoy the race?
Hi, Dan. I'm good, thanks. And just to correct you, I think it was 2010 was the wet to dry race in Melbourne. And ironically, it was a McLaren driver that won that one as well in Jenson Button. This one was a bit more straightforward, although it wasn't without its incidents. McLaren were dominant, but if it wasn't for the weather, then it could have been very much more straightforward than it was.
100%. I think, let's dive into McLaren. Clearly, the pace setters in Australia, they tried talking us all down after the impressive race simulation by Norris in pre-season testing. But no, they were on top in qualifying, front row lockout, claiming surprise at how slow Ferrari were in qualifying, locking out the fourth row, the Italian outfit. But there wasn't really a contender for McLaren in the dry in qualifying, was there? I think it was 3.5 tenths back. I think Verstappen was just the nearest challenger in third in the Red Bull. Obviously, Red Bull having their own problems, but Verstappen doing his best as always to drive around them. But Verstappen kept Norris and Piastri a bit honest at the start of the race, didn't he? When it was still damp, but by the minute it started drying out, McLaren were able to just eke out ahead. And then it all went crazy on lap 44 when the rain showers arrived again. But McLaren's pace was, as you say, really impressive. Norris able to hold on in that phase of the race at the end, even though there was a damaged floor on his car, so says Andrea Stella, and that pressure from Verstappen at the end after everybody had switched onto the intermediates. Norris did a really good job, I think. Probably one of his better wins, considering all the crazy conditions and how he sort of, didn't really put a foot wrong. I mean, he did go off on lap 44, didn't he? But he kept it together and, a fine drive from him. And, McLaren looking pretty ominously quick.
Yeah, I mean, McLaren were dominant, but as we saw last year, when they had the best car, they made a habit of throwing away wins. So credit where credit's due. Both Norris and the McLaren pit wall nailed it on Sunday. And I mean, the whole consensus around the paddock was that McLaren had the quickest car, but up until Q3, it really looked in the balance. And even after those first runs in Q3, I think they were 4th and 10th on the timesheets because Piastri skated wide at the penultimate corner. Norris had his effort invalidated for track limits at turn 4. So they both said the car's not easy to drive on low fuel, but on high fuel, it was in a different class on Sunday, come rain or shine. Just as you said, Verstappen kept them honest, but once he overheated his tyres, he made the mistake at turn 11 on lap 17. He then spurned 14 seconds in 10 laps to the McLarens. Their tyre preservation is just on another level, and that's the one area that they're right. That's the one area their rivals are picked out. I mean, Christian Horner labelled it as quite strange that they're able to generate sufficient temperature in the tyres at the start of stints, but then have that, they're able to extract more life out of it than the other cars. And that's the area that Toto Wolff as well pinpointed as the one where Mercedes got to get on top of because they were struggling with overheating.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? We had last year, we had a team that looked like a clear favourite and everybody was worried about, and they all got, and that was Red Bull, wasn't it? Obviously, this time around it's McLaren. Hopefully, the teams. I think the margin's not quite as big as it was last year, but hopefully the other teams can figure out the tricks that McLaren are playing with their tyres to make it a bit more of a closer fight.
But as George Russell pointed out, it's Red Bull only slipped back into the pack relatively because of their own mishaps with development based on where McLaren were last year. They always brought upgrades that seemed to work every single time. I don't think you can necessarily bet on that. And as I put in my preview piece when we were deciding who will win the championship, Norris's mistakes were highlighted quite a lot last year, and there's a reason that he can't win the championship, or maybe doesn't have the mental strength to deal with battling at the front. But he showed throughout last year that he's got the pace within himself to win races if the car's good. Look at Zandvoort, look at Singapore. McLaren have built that car, it looks like, on a consistent basis. If he just keeps doing what he's doing from the Australia weekend another 23 times, he'll be world champion. So Norris is definitely the overwhelming favourite, and it'll be interesting to see how Piastri responds now after his heartbreak. Because when both McLarens went off, he got pitched into a spin, got stuck in the grass for a little bit, managed to get it out, salvage some points, which who knows could be crucial come the end of the season. But at this early stage, to already be 23 points down on your teammate, we saw last year Norris did have a sizable edge over him, particularly in qualifying. Piastri looks like he closed that in Australia. He was less than a tenth behind. But if McLaren do have a dominant car that's capable of being 1-2, especially in these opening rounds, Piastri's going to need something similar to happen to Norris to claw that ground back. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how he responds, because you'd have to save it at this early stage. It's critical that he gets one up on Norris in China.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. I think, I mean, the thing that's lucky for Piastri is that there is 23 races left. Like, quite a lot, so much could happen in those 23 races. So, you can't, you'd think that maybe luck will swing the other way. Norris might have a race like that, and then all of a sudden it's closer again. But yeah, I think what was also telling, I think, from last year is McLaren saying they lost the championship in the first few races in terms of the Drivers' Championship because their car wasn't quite there. Obviously, they haven't got that issue this year. So I think whilst they can put their foot on the gas at this point in the season, it's going to really pay dividends come the end of the season. I mean, China as well was a track last year. This was before the Miami upgrades and then making that leap. But China, they were still strong, especially in that final phase of the race. Norris's run to second, he was on a par with Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. McLaren were quick in China last year, so I can see them being very quick this weekend and hard to catch. And yeah, as you say, Oscar definitely made an improvement in qualifying. That was an area 20-4. I think he got beat last year by Norris, really quite bad. So yeah, much closer, wasn't he? He was in a 10th. So there was such fine margins. And then in the race, I think he surrendered that track position to Verstappen at the start, spent some of his tyre life catching back up to Norris. There was the whole thing about the team orders staying put whilst they navigated traffic and the weather. And by then, Piastri had made a mistake. His tyres were cooked and he couldn't challenge for the win. And then obviously his heartbreaking moment. So he's got a lot to sort of, he's got a lot of motivation, I guess, to bounce back this weekend. But yeah, it all looks pretty rosy for McLaren otherwise. Red Bull, not so much. Really difficult practice sessions for them. Obviously, they made changes that Verstappen could extract something for them in qualifying. But again, Verstappen didn't have an answer really for McLaren in the race. He could only do what, his amazing talents can only take him so far. And the fact that they were having issues made it so much more difficult for Liam Lawson in the other side of the car. So let's talk about him for a little bit. A very difficult opening weekend at Red Bull for Lawson.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the worst case scenario, a Q1 exit and then not even making the finish. Just taking the results out of the equation, he would have, I'm sure, preferred to make it to the end, at least bank some more laps in that Red Bull. I mean, the noises at a Red Bull is kind of what we expect. Horner's, picked out the positives, defended him. We haven't heard Marco slander him as he would do with a more experienced driver, perhaps. But yeah, I think internally in his mind, although he'll say it's not the case, I think he will be feeling the pressure already going to China, because at the end of the day, it's a renowned poison chalice, that seat. And as soon as the pressure starts mounting, it's very hard to get out of that spiral. So I think that, like Piastri, not to the same degree, but still, he needs a strong weekend in China and just to bank some points, I'd say.
Yeah, and the task is going to be even more difficult for him there, isn't it? It's another track he's not driven that. It's a sprint weekend. So like in Australia, he missed FP3 with that technical issue and that hampered him in qualifying. He's going to have one practice session and then go straight into qualifying, straight into a sprint, straight into a Grand Prix qualifying session, all at a track he doesn't know, all in a Red Bull that does look quite tricky to get in the right window still, does look tricky to drive. So it's going to be I think the expectations for him should probably be quite low going into the weekend, because it looks like it's going to be a really tricky one for him again. Suzuka again could be tricky. Again, another track I don't think he really knows very well at all. Only from Well, he would have done Super Formula there, so that's something, I believe.
Got some experience. Better than
So,
China.
Better than China, but yeah, China's going to be a tricky weekend for him. And yeah, it looks like Red Bull have got to do quite a lot of work to catch back up to where they were at the start of last year. Mercedes, again, we were saying, weren't we, after testing, it was hard to pick who was going to fall where behind McLaren. It was like going to be a fight for second best. Mercedes looked like they were doing quite well, really. And obviously George Russell keeping his nose clean, as he often does. I think there's these crazy races sometimes, he does tend to end up in the right place at the right time. You think of Austria last year, he sort of just ended up with the win because he kept his nose clean. And here he kept his nose clean and got on the podium.
Azerbaijan as well for the podium last year.
Yeah, he just sneaks in there, which is good to see. And I mean, really valuable points for Mercedes as well. They made the good calls on the pit wall like McLaren did. But one of the stars of the weekend for me, and definitely the star of the weekend for Mercedes, was Kimi Antonelli. The hype train has well and truly left the station, and it's at full speed, if you ask me. Qualifying, obviously, he had that setback with the damaged front bib, but 16th through to 4th. Survived a spin at turn 3, flying past people on the outside of corners, not phased by the wet, not phased by being on intermediate tyres and changeable conditions. Just looking like the real deal, Antonelli wasn't he?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a very promising start for Mercedes post-Lewis Hamilton era. I mean, if you'd have told them in pre-season coming out of the opening race, you'd be locked on points with McLaren in the Constructors' Championship, they definitely have taken that. And while there is a car disadvantage to McLaren, I think for Mercedes and Red Bull and Ferrari, the teams that are playing catch-up, you've got to be there to bank the points when you can. And they capitalised on Piastri's spin. Toto was very, he was praising his drivers post-race, and Russell's really stepped up to being a leader. And I think you can definitely see that. I know you said there that he makes a habit of capitalising on incidents, but that he does also tend to throw away good points occasionally. And this was the type of race where that could have happened. But he said in this post-race press conference that very early on, he noticed that he didn't have the pace to live with the McLarens or Verstappen, but he had a comfortable buffer behind, and he just decided to bring it home. And that's the type of drive a veteran, which he's kind of approaching now, that experience status, definitely the established driver in the Mercedes team, should be delivering. And then as you mentioned, Antonelli was just superb. The skepticism post-qualifying was definitely there when he went out in Q1. Did have floor damage, but that was induced by himself. But yeah, in the race, like other than the one mistake he made, his overtakes were brilliant, and just seeing him rag the car around, inevitably that's going to lead to mistakes like we saw in Monza FP1 last year. But that's what happens with a rookie. The main thing is the speed there, and to come home 4th on your debut race in a race where many more senior drivers made mistakes, like Fernando Alonso. You can't fault him. He's did really, really well, and he's going to be a star to come, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to see what he's going to do moving forward. And as you say, he's like this rough diamond, isn't he? Like it's his ragged on the edge approach, as you say, but running the curbs that damaged his car in qualifying. And yeah, just he's got some. I'll say it politely, but he's got some big minerals. I think that paid dividends in the race, and reminiscent of that amazing Eau Rouge offline move he did on Franco Colapinto in Formula 2 last year. Like the guy's brave in the wet. So that was really cool to see. And China, you never know. There was mixed conditions last year, so we could see something similar. But even regardless, China's a great track in the dry, and it'll be interesting to see. It'll be good to see how he gets on in race conditions in the dry. Obviously the tyre management and all of those other sort of ingredients that not just raw speed will teach you. You need to, let's see. I think he's got quite an intelligent brain. I mean, there's all that talk of his memory of like his lap times and stuff like that. The way he spoke post race as well, I thought, very considered, evaluating like stint by stint. I think Antonelli shows that he could be the complete package that Wolff has been telling us. But yeah, let's talk about, I guess, Hamilton, the man who vacated the seat for Antonelli, and Hamilton and his new employers, Ferrari. Obviously, a lot of talk about Ferrari and Hamilton, and even Leclerc, of course, given his status as one of the best drivers on the grid. It looked quite good for them in practice. Then in qualifying, they were really off the pace. And then in the race, it was reminiscent of sort of maybe old Ferrari, if that's a fair assessment to say, in terms of interesting communications on the radio, which we can forgive on the Hamilton side because that's a new relationship. Confusion from the pit wall, not reading the situation properly with the incoming rain at the end of the race, gambling on staying out too long on the slicks, which really didn't pay off for Ferrari, and then coming home with only 5 points across both drivers. Really, really difficult and humbling weekend, I guess, for Ferrari. And it was hard to know where they were going to fall in the pecking order behind McLaren. Was it a case of, they could get on top of their issues, but it seems like their car's quite tricky to drive, especially in the wet. Probably, I think a lot of work for them to do before China. And that was a race last year where they fared quite well, obviously, in Australia last year, and then they got to China and they were quite underwhelming, weren't they? So it could be another tricky weekend for them. But not what Ferrari fans wanted, was it?
No, absolutely not. 5 points behind your customer team Sauber is definitely not what any of us were expecting. I did read quite a damning stat. I think it was along the lines of, since the turn of the century, Hamilton's debut result was the worst among a Ferrari driver other than Luca Badoa. So that kind of says it all, really. But that's not really a reflection on Hamilton's drive himself, because he didn't really put a foot wrong. Yes, you could say the pace to Leclerc, like the whole weekend, wasn't there. But he made no mistakes from what I remember. And it was just a case of, as you said, the Ferrari car was very difficult to drive in the wet. And as Leclerc pointed out, that's not a new thing. It's a radically different car compared to last year. But my memory goes back to, I think, since 2012. I mean, Alonso in that car was amazing in the wet. He got a few pole positions at Silverstone, Hockenheim. But since then, Ferrari always tended to struggle in the wet, no matter what cycle of regulations it's just been a historical problem in recent times, and they need to get on top of it, because wet races and wet sessions should bring opportunities, but Ferrari is kind of like they're dreading it because they know they won't have the pace to compete, especially against the likes of Verstappen, who has such an innate feel in these sorts of conditions. As I say, this weekend's massive for them, because with an impending regulation change on the horizon, teams are going to be, judging whether they invest more in this current car because they have a shot at the championship or a better championship position, or just, invest in the next generation car. And for Ferrari, they've come into a season, I'd say, for the first time in since 2019. Obviously, after they had the 2018 title push, they went into 2019 expecting to be a challenge to Mercedes. This is like the first real occasion where they've gone into a season and you expected them to start in championship contention, and they've just not delivered. I mean, they're 5 points. They're fortunate that Piastri span, because otherwise the gap to McLaren would already be quite sizable. But I mentioned about Mercedes capitalising on opportunities when you don't have the car pace. Ferrari certainly didn't do that, and it was a very uncharacteristic error from the pit wall under Vasseurs' leadership. And you saw on social media the same old rhetoric of typical Ferrari, but it's not been like that under Vasseurs. The pit wall have tended to get things right, but for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because of the car pace or whatnot, they tried a gamble that just didn't work. And I think it was evident to everybody at home and most other teams that it wasn't a gamble that was going to work. So I'm not sure why they risked it, but they did, and they paid the price.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think I agree with you there on all of those points, really. And I mean, if we think about it, they lost the Constructors' Championship by 14 points last season. So, you really don't want to be giving up those points at this stage of the season. The only thing I could say, or maybe obviously they took that big gamble at the end where they were running. I think they'd been running, was it before the rain shower? They were like 6th and 8th, weren't they? Wasn't really they weren't going to get an impressive haul of points. So I guess it was a sort of a win it or bin it situation from them to throw that Hail Mary with the strategy call at the end. But it really didn't pay off. And I wonder, it kind of reminds me, I mean, it's maybe too early to say, but if we look at McLaren at 2012, they were outside title challenger. Obviously, reliability issues back then sort of hampered them, but they had one of the strongest cars, strongest packages. They then went into the final year of a rule cycle and made quite a big concept change with the suspension. I think you can tell where I'm going with this. And then that car ended up being awful by their standards at the time, and they fell drastically back. Is there a fear that maybe Ferrari have rocked the boat too much, and maybe they should have done a more quieter evolution of the SF24?
I mean, yeah, that's a great comparison actually, because there are similarities there. Vasseur is convinced that what we saw from Ferrari from Friday in practice through to Q2 is their genuine pace, and that the gap to McLaren on Sunday wasn't representative. But they certainly don't have the pace to challenge McLaren at the moment, and the danger is introducing a new car at this stage in the regulations. If it's going to take them several races to understand it, they've not got 4 or 5 races to understand a car, because by the time they potentially get on top of it, the title might already be done and dusted. So, as you say, I think they took a massive gamble over the winter, and it might not work out, and the Tifosi's heartbreak might go on for another year.
And potentially longer, because if they spend too much time trying to figure this car out, that's time they're losing on 2026. And if I want to make my McLaren comparison run even further, the deliberation over the 2013 car development, then they turned up in 2014. They had a Mercedes power unit, which was way better than anybody else at the start of the hybrid era, but they were comfortably the worst Mercedes-powered team in 2014. They started off that rule cycle in a poor way. They run that risk. So, yeah, I think China and Suzuka are going to be very telling weekends for Ferrari. They really need to figure things out. But, it being Ferrari, it being Lewis Hamilton, the drama surrounding all that, I mean, it gives us a lot of meat to chew on, doesn't it? So let's move into the midfield, which is obviously quite a hotly contested area of F1, with a lot of cars sort of vying over those scraps that the top 4 teams leave for them. Williams, on results, you would say is probably the biggest winner of the midfield teams from Australia. Both cars into Q3, Albon qualifying 6th and Sainz qualifying 10th. Sainz's race obviously didn't end how he would have liked, with that mistake behind the safety car on the end of the first lap. But Albon doing an incredible drive to get it into 5th place, which for Williams that's almost a win for them compared to how they were last season. So a really strong start for Williams. They figured that they might be in that midfield fight with the likes of Alpine, being at the forefront of the midfield, I should say. And the Australia results and the way the team worked together, I mean, barring Sainz's unfortunate mishap, because you think he probably would have put in a strong race had he, but we will never know. But a really strong showing from Williams, and quite nice to see that the work they've been doing, all this talk we've had from James Vowles of like pushing the team forward. We're making, the changes they made in their processes last year. They sort of took one step back in 2024, and it looks like they're leaping 2 steps forward as a result.
Yeah, it's a surprise really, because the whole sounds coming out of the Williams camp at the end of last year was, look, 2025 could be another difficult year, but 2026 is the goal. But it appears they're actually going to have a very competitive midfield package, and McLaren's prediction that they could be knocking at the heels of the top teams this season, it looks like it's realistic. I mean, with how close the margins are over 1 lap, it looks like they can get amongst it. And yes, they might not have necessarily the pace in race conditions to hold it there, but if we get more races like Sunday where there are changeable conditions and you get one team like Ferrari dropping the ball, Williams are there to pick up the pieces. And we'll get obviously onto the rest of the teams later, but when you look at the rundown of the order, Albon banked 10 points. The other midfield teams that scored were Aston Martin and Sauber, 2 teams who you'd say don't have the pace of Williams over 1 lap, and probably in race conditions in the dry as well. Williams already got a head start on their probably main rivals, which are Alpine. And a huge credit for that goes to Alex Albon, because he's rebuilt his reputation since moving to Williams in 2022. But there was always that caveat of, but how good is he because of his teammate record? I mean, he's gone up against Latifi and Sargent, and then there was obviously Colapinto came in as an emergency replacement for Sargent last year, he hadn't been up against a proven driver, and I think most people have gone in with the expectation that Sainz will have to measure over Albon, and that's no disgrace against Albon. It's just that Sainz is a multiple-time race winner now, who's one of the very best on the grid. And it looked like that, Sainz had already got the impetus in his favour when he topped FP1, but Albon came back brilliantly, out-qualified him, and then in the race headed Williams' charge, and he deserves a lot of credit. And it looks like, Williams have got a really strong lineup going into the season and a very strong car.
Yes, I think as well, James Vowles was saying how Albon, I think it was on a Beyond the Grid episode last year, how Albon's going to rise to the challenge that Sainz poses. And if round one is, anything to go by, then Albon definitely rose to that challenge. Obviously, Sainz, like a lot of these drivers who've switched teams, switched power units, all the things that go around with that, has some acclimatization to do. But also, I think what you say about them being in the mix and qualifying with those big teams, they have the two drivers to capitalize on that. We know that they're both good qualifiers. They're both experienced. So you can bank on them really getting in the mix there and qualifying. And they both did. Albon, obviously, knowing the team well, performing better. Sainz obviously said after testing, he wasn't comfortable with finding the limit, but he found the limit enough to get into the top 10 of qualifying. And you could think as well, them being in those positions in races, they're both experienced drivers that you think they can really put up a fight as well and get in Albon was in Hamilton's way for that whole race. Obviously, Hamilton having difficulties, but you think in China, if they're in the top 10, they've got some faster cars behind them. Let's say it's dry conditions. Albon and Sainz are the sort of drivers you could bank on putting up a bit of a fight to make sure that they take those points home. So I think it's going to be a really exciting year for them, and it's good to see. And I think, obviously, my analogy of Ferrari, them having development problems now, could that compound their development issues next year? With Williams wanting to put in so much effort into next year's regulations, to have a good car this year, I think really helps with that, because it removes a headache for them. It removes a problem. They know that if they can start this season strong, pick up good points, they know they're not going to upgrade this car much, but they can be safe in the knowledge that this car is going to get them through the season in a good way. So I think that's really good to see, to be honest. It being a legacy team, people wanting Sainz to do well after losing the Ferrari seat. I think Williams was a feel-good story of the weekend. Another good story, I think, in terms of teams was Sauber. Gabriel Bortoleto silencing the B driver criticisms from Helmut Marko by getting the Sauber into Q2. Obviously, the race didn't end well for him with the sort of the wet to dry phase at the end of the race. He didn't make the finish, but Hülkenberg got his Sauber into P7, eclipsing the team's entire points haul from 2024. So quite a good start from them. And whereas last year when they did have a car that could maybe pick up points, there was issues that weren't performance related that stopped them. So really good that the inverse is happening now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, that they were there to capitalize on it, and especially a driver like Hülkenberg. He hasn't necessarily capitalized when a big point scoring return's been on the cards in his career, but in the midfield he's always been there. It was a surprise actually to see Bortoleto qualify him. So there might have been a bit of pressure on Hülkenberg to show why he's the more experienced driver and the one that Audi have invested in for the long term to lead the project. And he did that on Sunday. I can't recall him making any errors. He just quietly went about his business and brought it home. And for Sauber as well, they brought, I think, a few upgrades this weekend, which the consensus had been that they were going to be the slowest team entering this season. They looked like they were actually, well within the midfield, which was last year they started off well, as you mentioned. They ended well, but in the middle phase of the year, they were almost guaranteed to go out in Q1 every time. So at least now they're competitive, and on a weekend, it's like at the front, we make this, Fred Vasseur mentions it a lot about how, because the gaps are so small, there's so many variables at a Grand Prix weekend that can dictate the balance of power. That's the exact same, thing that could be played for the midfield. And if Sauber prop up at a weekend and the drivers are on form, the car suits the track, the conditions suit the car, then they could easily score more points. And it's nice to see them not being struggling at the back like they were last year.
100%. And I think what was it, Mattia Binotto said in an interview with Autosport last year, he arrived at a Sauber team that he felt like was frozen. And it looks like he's maybe, got the ice pick out and he's sort of freed them from that sort of state of mind, which is good. And I think good for Bortoleto as well to have a car that he can fight a little bit with in terms of his development as a rookie and the importance that will have for Audi. Because obviously you say Hulkenberg's there long-term to lead the project, but in terms of them signing Bortoleto, a rookie, much younger in terms of years, Audi could look to have him for a very long time in the seat if he performs well. So I think having a car that he can actually show what he can do is going to be important. And I'm sure he'll bounce back from the disappointment at the end of his race as well moving forward. He's a quick learner. We've seen that. He's a rookie champion back-to-back in Formula 3 and Formula 2. So a good showing from him. Aston Martin, Lance Stroll, slotting it into 6th place. Again, another driver who quietly went about their business. Perhaps we should have mentioned him before Hulkenberg's 7th place finish. But obviously, Fernando Alonso making his error at the exit of turn 6 on lap 34, which triggered that safety car and took him out of the race. Aston Martin were kind of coy on where they'd be, weren't they, really, in the midfield pack? Nobody was really expecting them to be at the front of it. But again, as you say, picking up a solid batch of points for a midfield outfit, 8 points for Stroll in 6th. So something for them to build on. Again, this is a team that's really going to be looking at 2026. We know that for sure. Adrian Newey's not even looking at the 2025 car from what we've heard from the team. So I think, again, another case of bagging points when there's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think it will just be a case of, as you say, they'll get the points they can, and where they end up is where they end up. They don't exactly need the prize money desperately with Lawrence Stroll bankrolling the team. And they'd much rather have a stronger footing for 2026. Looking at qualifying, they qualified 12th and 13th, but you'd have to tell a normal weekend if Antonelli didn't have the floor damage and Lawson had a bit more preparation, you could bump those two down immediately 2 spots, and then the complexion looks completely different. The car it looks more benign to drive than its predecessor, but pace-wise relative to the competition, it doesn't look like a step forward from the end of last season. So that's why when you have races like yesterday, it's important that the drivers capitalise. And while it might be Fernando Alonso, the wily old fox that would often do that, on this occasion it was Lance Stroll. And for all his critics, and the last time he had a wet race in Brazil last year, he did beat shit in the gravel on the formation lap. This time around, he was faultless. And the biggest praise you can give him is the fact that I don't recall seeing him even once on the broadcast, and yet he popped up in P6, only behind Albon among the midfielders. So, yeah, he was very happy with that on the post-race radio with his new engineer, which I believe is Gary Gannon from Haas, who they recruited over the winter. So, yeah, good start to their partnership and a good start for Stroll's season, because it's important for him as well to have that confidence, because he is a driver that if things are going against him, he can get down very quickly, and he's then stuck in a rut, and that reflects in his interviews and also his driving. So it's good for him that he started on a strong note. And for Aston Martin, I think it'll be a case of just seeing out this season, getting what they can get, and all eyes are on 2026.
Yeah, and I think as well they've made those sort of structural changes as well, with Andy Cowell coming as team principal, Mike Crack taking that chief trackside officer. So those changes as well, they need to get used to that. So to do so and yield strong results is only going to be a benefit for them moving forward. Alpine, not as good a showing for them really as they would have probably hoped for, picking up no points, Gasly finishing outside the top 10 and 11th, Doohan obviously having that error on lap 1. But, a rookie, those road-painted lines, wet conditions on a street circuit, more experienced drivers, as we said, Alonso was caught out, so that can happen. And Doohan, I thought, actually, up until that point, had a strong weekend. He wasn't being completely outclassed by Gasly. He fared, admirably in qualifying. He was doing well handling the pressure of all this speculation around him and his future, being his home Grand Prix. So I think Doohan can have a lot of positives to take out of the weekend, despite it being a DNF. But Alpine obviously would have liked to have come away with points, especially it being a wet race and the way that they capitalised in Brazil last year. But too early to ring alarm bells for them. They still look like they might be in that fight, but even in the dry through practice and qualifying, they didn't quite have the measure of Williams or Racing Bulls even over one lap.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise because the general paddock consensus was that Alpine were in that mix with Williams at the front of the midfield. And one thing we haven't actually mentioned on the podcast yet is that Australia is a bit of an anomaly on the calendar. So could it be a case of, the car just wasn't well suited to Albert Park, and then we get to a more conventional circuit like Shanghai this weekend, and they're right at the front of the midfield because it's so close? We just don't know. As you touched on Doohan, Flavio Briatore, so on the Netflix documentary, appears to have already put a lot of pressure on him to perform. But when his own, the driver that he manages, Fernando Alonso, makes a mistake, I don't think he can criticise Doohan too much on this one. I think Jack had a decent debut. I think in Q1 he was basically matching Gasly, and then I'm fairly certain in Q2 he was lagging quite a bit behind and got knocked out. But his last effort was compromised because Hamilton span at turn 11. DRS on the preceding straight was disabled, so that would have cost him lap time. And also another thing to mention is that Alpine is their last year using the Renault engine. We know that it's down on power, so when the gaps are so fine in qualify, when the engines are turned up, they have got that last bit of extra grunt, which could cost them this season. But yeah, they should have. You'd have expected when there were 14 finishers and the two Haas cars were not in the mix, effectively 12 runners contesting points places. They didn't pick up a single one. They'll be very disappointed with that, especially when Williams have picked up 10 points. And Gasly was in the points until he made that late mistake, which I believe let the Ferraris and Piastri through. But whether he would have been able to hold on to that regardless, just because of the difference in pace, is unlikely. But I think with Alpine, we'll have to wait and see how they do this weekend, if it is dry, to measure where their true pace in the midfield is.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. You mentioned, obviously, Australia being an anomaly. From pre-season testing, people weren't sure where Racing Bulls were going to be in that midfield mix, whether they were going to be more on the outside looking in. But in Australia, through practice, both drivers getting into the top 10, qualifying, Yuki Tsunoda having that incredible qualifying performance in 5th, Hadjar just missing out on Q3 in 11th. There was a real opportunity again for Racing Bulls to pick up some big points. Tsunoda was running in the mix in the top 10 for the majority of the race. And obviously Hadjar had that heartbreaking exit when he lost the control of the car in the formation lap. And, the world feed, we saw him distraught in tears, obviously missing out on making a strong debut. But similar to their Italian counterparts at Ferrari, they made the wrong call later in the race in terms of when to pit Tsunoda, and he dropped out of the top 10 when there was a real chance for Racing Bulls to make some real headway there.
Yeah, I think we've seen this on a few occasions with Racing Bulls over the year for its various guises, that when you do have these sort of races where there are opportunities, the pit wall is lacking a bit, and that's a shame for Tsunoda because he was faultless all weekend. His qualifying lap was sensational. In the race, he was locking down, I believe, P6 behind Leclerc. He was kind of running just about a couple of seconds ahead of Albon, and he was looking on course for a strong points finish, which after pre-season you wouldn't have guessed, because even Racing Bulls were being quite downbeat about their prospects. They've not made as much progress relative to the rest to be in a position where they're headed in the midfield like last season, but there Yuki was just running in clear air and managing his own race, not making any mistakes. Made a move on Leclerc when the track dried out and everything was looking so good. But yeah, like Ferrari, they left Yuki out and he was resigned to finishing outside the point, which is a massive shame for him at such a pivotal time in his career, because we've obviously heard that Red Bull won't be able to let him go. Potential suitors, although it wasn't his fault that he finished in 12th, and this performance in the short term is remembered, when you think 6 months down the line, our team's going to be remembering Tsunoda's race in Australia, probably not. Whereas if he had a P5 like Albon to his name on the results sheet, that could have made a world of difference. So yeah, doubly frustrating for Tsunoda, really.
Yes, I agree. One thing I will say, though, in terms of obviously his position within the Red Bull setup, he seems to have obviously there's all this talk about him taking on that leadership role, isn't there? Him being a team leader at Racing Bulls, and obviously he's spoken as well, being sort of positively embracing that. His performance in Australia really showed that he's prepared to step up and be that team leader and really lead that team forward. And in terms of the remit, obviously, of what Red Bull wants to do with Racing Bulls, they want to push the team forward. If he's putting in those strong results, that I see, and the opportunities outside are limited, I see no reason for him to not just keep going, with Racing Bulls in 2026. If he can put together a year that really is really strong, he really leads that team into the midfield fight. And there's also a sense of he's missed out on this Red Bull drive, but looking at the difficulties that drivers have had there, would that have been the best move for his career if he'd have gone into and had the same issues that Lawson had in Australia? We'd all be saying the same things about Tsunoda, but we're saying about Lawson right now, about how it's going to be so difficult. So, I think he's taken a really good approach to not getting that Red Bull promotion. And I think Racing Bulls is going to benefit from a whole. And I think he's going to benefit from it long term if they can make some better calls on the pit wall. That's the thing. And we'll see how they get on in China. This could all be academic and he might have an absolute howler and, they have great pit calls. And hopefully as well, quickly touching on Hadjar, in terms of the rookies that came into the season, probably with the least hype, you had Antonelli, massive hype around him being Hamilton's replacement. Behrman obviously came in with a lot of hype given his debut with Ferrari last year in Jeddah and his appearances with Haas. Doohan as well, obviously getting that head start and just being more of a known entity. Bortoletto coming in as F2 champion. And then Hadjar coming in at the last possible point, really, as the F2 vice champion. But up until obviously that heartbreaking error he made on the formation lap, he was really doing a really good job. Obviously being in the top 10 in those practice sessions, just missing out on Q3, showing that he's got the speed to, be amongst it. So let's hope he can bounce back this weekend. We've talked about a lot of people who need to bounce back. Haas probably need the biggest bounce of them all. They did their sort of, I guess now routine trick of only doing high fuel load long runs and testing and not being particularly concerned about it this time around. But they arrived in Melbourne and basically stayed rooted to the bottom of the timing sheets, no matter what the session was. Behrman having his troubles, obviously crashing out of FP1, which rendered him out of FP2. He finished the race and got through the race sort of, mistake-free, which is good because he really struggled in the wet in Brazil. But Haas, the pace just doesn't seem to be there. Australia's an anomaly, we know that, but they were comfortably the slowest team. And they really got to figure things out quite quickly, haven't they? If they're going to have a similar season to what they had last year.
Yeah, they weren't just slowest of all, they were slowest of all by quite a margin. Just look at the qualifying times here. Obviously, Behrman didn't set one because of a gearbox problem that arose in Q1. But Ocon was on a 117.1. He was about half a tenth off Lawson, but then obviously Lawson didn't complete his last run. The gap to Hulkenberg in 17th was about half a second. And that was on genuine pace. That wasn't a case of Ocon didn't string his lap together or have problems. That was genuine pace. And that was the consistent theme throughout the race weekend. As you said, whether it was practice, qualifying, or the race, the car had absolutely no pace. And it wasn't just hanging on at the rear. It was a backmarker territory, effectively. That's what it kind of felt like with Haas. And you'd have to say, unless it's an Australia-specific problem, they haven't gone well at this circuit. Ironically, they used to go very well at this circuit, but last year and they didn't do too well here. Unless it's a circuit-specific problem, if it carries over into the next few rounds, then you'd have to say there's a fundamental problem with that car. Over the winter, they were expressing that they've found a lot of time in the virtual tools saying they're going to make a big leap. That's always a danger to come out making such bold declarations, and it's bitten them because they don't look, the car, it doesn't look a handful to drive. It doesn't look quick. And you'd have to feel for both Ocon and Behrman. Ocon, because of what he went through with Alpine last year, he spent most of the year being at the back anyway. And then Behrman, he's coming in as a rookie with a lot of hype, and he's driving a car that he's not getting to show his potential with. So, yeah, for Haas, they'll be hoping that it was just an Australia-specific problem, but I'm not hopeful that their promise is going to show in China.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think also what's a shame about it is if we go back in time with Haas, they had 2018 was their really strong year. I believe they finished fifth in the constructors table, and then immediately 2019 they fell back. They didn't capitalize on that, and then they went through a few years of pain. Last year was their best year in several seasons again, and you were kind of. I got the sense, I don't know about you, but I got the sense that they were on an upward trajectory. They weren't in that place anymore where they would dramatically fall back and sort of, I guess, yo-yo in a way, in the ways they have done in the past. But based on the limited evidence, admittedly, we've got so far, it looks like they've done that. They've taken those steps back again, which is a shame to see because obviously we never want to see anyone do poorly. So yeah, as you say, they've got a lot to do, and I think a lot of answers will come out of this weekend in terms of where their performance lies. They've got 2 qualifying sessions, so they're going to get twice as much one-lap data. So hopefully that pays dividends for them. But yeah, and as you say, like Ocon has made that move in good faith. He had those problems last year with Alpine, especially at the start of the season. Behrman, as a rookie, wants to show what he can do. So yeah, let's see if they can turn it around. But I guess that's all the teams covered. Let's quickly look ahead a little bit more to China. We kind of have anyway, but I'm just going to ask you for your predictions of who's going to win. Probably going to be the same as mine, and I could probably guess what yours is. But let's go for a prediction, shall we?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it's pretty obvious who we're going to say is going to win. I'll probably take pole as well. It has to be McLaren based on Australia, but just to spice it up a bit and to not be boring, I'm going to go an extra step further and say they'll win by 30 plus seconds over the nearest non-McLaren car. Christ. Providing it's a dry race and there's no safety cars or anything.
Okay. And which driver are you going to pick?
You'd have to bet on Lando. I mean, last year he got second here, as we alluded to. And he just has that slight measure over Oscar. I mean, obviously we need a bigger sample size for this season to see whether Oscar's taken that step from last year to be a more regular challenger to Norris. But I think Norris just has that extra little ounce of pace and that bit better execution, a bit more maturity, and that will carry him through this weekend. But as I say, if McLaren do have a dominant package, I will be rooting for Oscar, just not to win, but to give us a fight at the front, because that's what we want to see. We don't want to see just one team dominance like we've had with Verstappen over the years, or Hamilton or Vettel, or several names you go back for history and say have dominated this season. If it's one team who are miles clear of the rest, you want to see the 2 drivers in the team going against each other. And you have to say with McLaren, they have a driver combination that has that potential. You could definitely see Oscar with what he showed in his first 2 years in F1 being a rival to Norris. It's not like a Verstappen-Perez situation where one's a de facto number 1 and one's a de facto number 2. Piastri has the potential. It's just about stringing it together on a consistent basis, which Norris looks like he might be finally able to do this season.
Yeah, I definitely think it's probably Lando's to lose this weekend. I'll put him as the favourite. Let's put him as the favourite. And like you say, I mean, I don't know if the gaps can be as big as 30 seconds, but if it is, it'll be really interesting because that'll give McLaren a unique position where they've got both drivers wanting to win and they've got the freedom behind them to maybe let them race. So that could be interesting. And as you say, when there's one team dominating, we want to see both drivers competing in that one team. So fingers crossed that happens. Not long for us to find out. Only a few days until Formula One heads to Shanghai. But for now, let's bring an end to our proceedings here on Motorsport Speak. Thank you, Taylor, for joining me, and thank you, listeners, for joining us. Make sure you like and subscribe. Comment if you think our predictions and chit-chat's nonsense, or comment if you think it's great and it's genius. We don't mind either way. Make sure to keep up to date on Motorsport Monday and MotorsportWeek.com, and follow us on socials at Motorsport Week on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, you name it. But for now, goodbye.